The Vietnam War, a conflict that deeply scarred the 20th century, continues to hold relevance even decades later. It was a conflict fueled by complex ideological clashes, political maneuvering, and a fervent desire for independence. The Vietnam War, often referred to as the Second Indochina War, was a protracted and brutal struggle that pitted the communist North Vietnam and its southern allies, known as the Viet Cong, against the anti-communist South Vietnam and its principal ally, the United States. Spanning roughly 2 decades, from the early 1950s to 1975, the Vietnam War became a defining conflict of the Cold War era. The war's roots, however, ran far deeper than the ideological divide of the Cold War. To comprehend the Vietnam War, we must journey back in time, tracing the historical currents that led to this devastating conflict. For centuries, Vietnam, a nation blessed with fertile rice paddies and a strategic location in Southeast Asia, had been coveted by foreign powers. The Chinese, for instance, ruled Vietnam for nearly a millennium, leaving an indelible mark on the nation's culture and identity. In the 19th century, it was the French who set their sights on Vietnam, eager to expand their colonial empire. French colonialism, which began in the mid-1800s, brought with it profound changes to Vietnamese society. The Japanese occupation of Vietnam during World War II proved to be a turning point. Vietnamese nationalists, led by figures like Ho Chi Minh, saw this as an opportunity to assert their claim for independence. Ho Chi Minh, a seasoned revolutionary, returned to Vietnam in 1941 after years of exile, bringing with him the experience and ideological fervor to galvanize the Vietnamese people. Under Ho Chi Minh's leadership, the Viet Minh, a coalition of nationalist and communist groups, emerged as a formidable force, battling both the Japanese occupiers and the remnants of French colonial administration. The Viet Minh's guerrilla tactics, combined with their deep-rooted support among the peasantry, allowed them to effectively challenge their more powerful adversaries. Ho Chi Minh's declaration of independence was met with fierce resistance from France, setting the stage for the First Indochina War, which lasted from 1946 to 1954. This brutal conflict pitted the Viet Minh, armed with guerrilla tactics and unwavering resolve, against the French forces, backed by superior firepower, but struggling to adapt to the challenging terrain and the unwavering determination of their adversaries. Despite their superior weaponry, the French found themselves increasingly bogged down in a protracted and costly war. The Viet Minh, masters of guerrilla warfare, utilized the dense jungles and intricate network of tunnels to their advantage, launching surprise attacks and then melting back into the countryside, frustrating the French forces. The fall of Dien Bien Phu in May 1954 marked a turning point in the war, shattering French morale and effectively ending their hopes of maintaining control of Vietnam. America's entry, the escalation of a conflict. The 1954 Geneva Accords officially ended the First Indochina War, dividing Vietnam along the 17th parallel. The North, under the leadership of Ho Chi Minh and the Communist Viet Minh, would become the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. The South, initially under Emperor Bao Dai, and later led by Ngo Dinh Diem, became the Republic of Vietnam, a staunchly anti-communist state. The Geneva Accords stipulated that the division was temporary, with nationwide elections planned for 1956 to reunify the country. Escalation from advisors to combat troops. The early 1960s saw a dramatic escalation of U.S. involvement in Vietnam. Initially, President John F. Kennedy sent military advisors to train and assist the South Vietnamese Army, believing that a limited U.S. presence could help stabilize the South and prevent a communist takeover. However, the situation on the ground proved far more complex and intractable than anticipated. The Viet Cong, masters of guerrilla warfare, blended seamlessly into the civilian population, making it difficult to distinguish friend from foe. The Tet Offensive, a turning point. By 1968, the Vietnam War had become a bloody stalemate. The U.S. military, despite its superior firepower, struggled to defeat an elusive enemy who refused to fight on conventional terms. The Viet Cong, though suffering heavy losses, remained a potent force, launching daring attacks and eroding the South Vietnamese government's control over the countryside. In January 1968, as the Vietnamese people prepared to celebrate Tet, the Lunar New Year, North Vietnam launched a surprise offensive that would shake the war to its core. Section 3. A War of Attrition, Search and Destroy, Bombing Campaigns, and the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Following the Tet Offensive, the U.S. strategy in Vietnam shifted towards a war of attrition. The aim was no longer to achieve a decisive military victory, but rather to inflict heavy casualties on the enemy, erode their morale, and force them to negotiate from a position of weakness. U.S. forces, under General William Westmoreland, adopted a strategy of search and destroy, deploying helicopters to insert troops into suspected enemy strongholds, where they would attempt to engage and eliminate Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces. These operations, while often resulting in high enemy body counts, also led to heavy civilian casualties and widespread destruction, further alienating the Vietnamese populace. The fall of Saigon and the end of an era. By the early 70s, public support for the Vietnam War had dwindled significantly. Anti-war protests gained momentum. In 1973, the U.S. and North Vietnam signed the Paris Peace Accords, ending U.S. involvement. In spring 1975, North Vietnamese forces launched a massive offensive. On April 30, 1975, North Vietnamese tanks entered the presidential palace in Saigon. The fall of Saigon became an enduring symbol of the war's chaotic end. Section 1. The Global Stage: International Involvement in Vietnam. The Vietnam War was far from a localized conflict. It became a focal point of Cold War tensions, drawing in major powers and exposing the intricate web of international alliances. The United States, driven by its policy of containment and the domino theory, invested heavily in supporting South Vietnam. The Soviet Union and China, on the other hand, provided North Vietnam with military aid, economic assistance, and diplomatic backing. The Soviet Union's involvement stemmed from its ideological commitment to supporting communist movements worldwide and its desire to counter U.S. influence in Southeast Asia. Moscow saw Vietnam as an opportunity to tie down U.S. resources and weaken its global standing. The Soviets supplied North Vietnam with sophisticated weaponry, including surface-to-air missiles, which posed a significant threat to U.S. aircraft. China, still recovering from its own civil war and wary of both Soviet and U.S. influence, also saw strategic value in supporting North Vietnam. Beijing provided weapons, training, and logistical support, viewing a communist victory in Vietnam as a blow against U.S. imperialism in Asia. Beyond the major powers, the Vietnam War also drew in allies and participants from various countries. South Korea, Thailand, Australia, and New Zealand sent troops to fight alongside the South Vietnamese and U.S. forces, reflecting their alignment with the U.S.-led anti-communist bloc. The presence of these international forces underscored the global dimensions of the conflict and the high stakes involved. Section 2. The Home Front Anti-War Movement and Societal Divisions. As the Vietnam War dragged on, with mounting casualties and no clear end in sight, opposition to the war grew steadily within the United States. What began as scattered protests on college campuses evolved into a massive anti-war movement that shook American society to its core. The anti-war movement drew support from a diverse coalition of students, civil rights activists, intellectuals, artists, and ordinary citizens disillusioned by the war's human cost and its impact on American values. They questioned the morality of U.S. involvement, arguing that the war was a violation of Vietnamese sovereignty and a drain on resources that could be better spent addressing domestic issues. Television played a pivotal role in galvanizing the anti-war movement. For the first time in history, images of the war's brutality, including graphic footage of combat, civilian casualties, and the use of napalm, were beamed directly into American living rooms, bringing the horrors of war closer to home and challenging the government's sanitized narrative. The anti-war movement was met with a mixture of support and opposition within American society. While many sympathized with the protesters' calls for peace and questioned the war's justification, others viewed them as unpatriotic or even treasonous. The war created deep divisions within families, communities, and the nation as a whole, polarizing public opinion and fueling social unrest. Political leaders and the Vietnam quagmire. The Vietnam War shaped the presidencies of Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon. Each faced complex decisions with significant consequences. Eisenhower provided aid to South Vietnam. Kennedy increased military advisors but had doubts. Johnson escalated the war, deploying troops. Nixon promised to end the war, pursuing Vietnamization. The war left a lasting impact on American politics. The soldiers' experience in Vietnam. The Vietnam War was a soldier's nightmare. Thrust into a hostile environment, they faced an elusive enemy and constant threat of death. The average age of a U.S. soldier was 19, many barely old enough to vote.
These young men, from diverse backgrounds, bonded over shared experiences of fear and camaraderie. The jungle was an unforgiving enemy. Dense foliage created an eerie sense of claustrophobia and fear of ambush. The humid heat bred swarms of insects and tropical diseases. Booby traps lurked everywhere, turning every step into a risk.
The Viet Cong, masters of guerrilla warfare, blended into the civilian population and struck with deadly surprise. They used tunnels, booby traps, and hit-and-run tactics, sowing doubt and paranoia among U.S. troops.
The psychological toll was immense. Soldiers witnessed unimaginable horrors, the death of comrades and the suffering of civilians. Many struggled with moral injury, guilt, and shame. The stress and fear led to PTSD, haunting them long after their return home.
Section 2. A Nation Torn. The Impact on Vietnamese Civilians. While the Vietnam War exacted a heavy toll on soldiers from all sides, it was the Vietnamese people who bore the brunt of the conflict. Caught in the crossfire of a war that raged for decades, they endured unimaginable suffering, their lives irrevocably altered by the conflict's devastating impact.
Their homes, villages, and livelihoods were shattered, leaving behind physical and emotional scars that transcended generations. The war displaced millions of Vietnamese civilians. Fleeing the fighting, they sought refuge in overcrowded cities, makeshift camps, or neighboring countries, leaving behind their ancestral lands and familiar rhythms of life. They faced constant food shortages, inadequate sanitation, and the ever-present threat of disease.
The war's brutality extended far beyond the battlefield. Civilians, often caught in the crossfire or suspected of collaborating with the enemy, became victims of massacres, torture, and indiscriminate bombings. The My Lai massacre, a horrific incident in which U.S. soldiers killed hundreds of unarmed Vietnamese civilians, stands as a chilling testament to the war's capacity for barbarity.
The war's legacy continued to haunt Vietnam long after the fighting ceased. Agent Orange, a highly toxic herbicide used by the U.S. military to defoliate jungles and destroy enemy crops, left a devastating environmental and health legacy. Millions of Vietnamese, both soldiers and civilians, were exposed to the chemical, leading to birth defects, cancers, and other chronic health problems that persisted for decades.
Section 3. Homecoming and Healing, the Aftermath of Vietnam. For many U.S. soldiers, returning home from Vietnam was a difficult and isolating experience. Unlike previous generations of returning veterans who were greeted with parades and public adulation, Vietnam veterans often faced indifference, hostility, or even outright scorn.
The war's unpopularity, coupled with the psychological scars many carried, made it challenging to reintegrate into civilian life. Public perception of the war and its veterans was deeply divided. Some viewed veterans as heroes who had served their country with honor, while others saw them as villains responsible for the war's atrocities. This polarized climate made it difficult for veterans to share their experiences or seek the support they desperately needed.
Many veterans struggled to cope with the invisible wounds of war. Haunted by nightmares, flashbacks, and survivor's guilt, they grappled with post-traumatic stress disorder, a condition that often manifested in anger, depression, substance abuse, and difficulty maintaining relationships. The lack of adequate mental health care and societal understanding only compounded their challenges.
The Vietnam War also left an indelible mark on American society, fostering a climate of disillusionment, distrust in government, and a reluctance to engage in foreign interventions. The war's legacy continues to shape debates about U.S. foreign policy, military intervention, and the treatment of veterans.
Reflections and lessons learned. The Vietnam War left an enduring legacy on nations and individuals. It stands as a reminder of the human cost of war and the power of resilience. The psychological wounds continue to reverberate through generations. For Vietnam, it was a struggle for independence and reunification. The country emerged determined to rebuild and forge a new future. Today, Vietnam is rapidly developing, embracing economic liberalization. The war's legacy shapes Vietnam's identity and its relationship with the U.S. The Vietnam War had a profound impact on the United States. It led to a reassessment of U.S. foreign policy and public trust. The war highlighted the limits of American power. It serves as a cautionary tale about military intervention and understanding culture. It underscores the importance of supporting returning veterans. The lessons of the Vietnam War remain relevant today. War should always be a last resort. Diplomacy and empathy are essential. Section 2. The Unhealed Wounds. Echoes of Vietnam in the Modern World. The Vietnam War's echoes still resonate in global power corridors. It highlights the limits of military might and the need for clear objectives. The war shapes debates on military force and U.S. global roles. It fuels a desire for government transparency and a free press. The war's environmental and health impacts linger. Agent Orange's effects still plague Vietnam and veterans. The war sparks dialogue, empathy, and understanding. Learning from the past helps create a more peaceful world.